We will say good day, and we will begin this transmission with the reminder that it is titled Fairy Tales for Grown-Ups. And we remind you that in our last transmission, we spoke about using the idea of a spinning wheel to create the illusion of a spoke freezing in place to indicate what it is that you are focusing on at that moment that you need to look at, whether it be a representation of your passion or a representation of a belief system that might be required for you to look at. But in this transmission, even though it will involve spinning wheels as a symbol again, this will be quite different, because what we are doing here is examining two particular fairy tales in your culture, Sleeping Beauty, Rumpelstiltskin, both of which contain the symbol of a spinning wheel for different reasons, different purposes. But the idea of this particular transmission is to help guide you in your discernment in stories, in fairy tales, and the stories you tell yourself, to be able to tell the difference between what is really a positive belief system and a negative belief system, because many of you may have an idea of what the fairy tales, Sleeping Beauty and Rumpelstiltskin, may represent, and what elements within them may be positive and or negative, but you may be surprised to find that there may be some things that are the opposite of what you may think. So before we dive into the idea of being able to tell the difference between the positive and negative belief systems that these fairy tales represent, let us give you a very brief recap so that each of you can remember, because it may be a while since you've heard them, what these fairy tale stories are actually all about. In Sleeping Beauty, you have the idea of a great feast that was arranged because of the birth of the princess to the king and queen. But there was only so much room at the table for all the guests that they chose to invite, some of which were the fairies of the land. And so, because there was one fairy that they didn't necessarily feel had the best of intentions, the best of energy, they chose to not invite that particular fairy. But that particular fairy heard about the feast nevertheless, and showed up at a point where many of the other fairies had already bestowed their magical gifts upon the princess, except for one. And so, upon her arrival, this fairy, being very offended at not being invited, chose to put a curse upon the princess, and said that on her 16th birthday, she would prick her finger on the needle of a spinning wheel and die. Now, everyone was very distraught, of course, at this, and after that fairy left, the final fairy, who had not yet bestowed her gift upon the princess, could only bestow just enough to change the curse to the point where the princess would not die, but would simply fall asleep until such time as someone would come along and with a kiss awaken her. That is the basic gist of Sleeping Beauty. Rumpelstiltskin, a little bit different, where a poor man had a daughter, and it was time for this man to pay taxes, but not having the money, the poor man promised his daughter to the king instead, promising that she had the magical ability to spin straw into gold. Well, the king could not pass this up, and so he took the daughter to the castle and locked her in a room with straw and a spinning wheel, and said, "If you will spin this straw into gold, you will gain your freedom, and I will marry you." Now, the princess in that sense, or the girl, not yet a princess, was beside herself because she had no ability whatsoever to spin straw into gold. Nevertheless, at some point, the door creaked open, and a little elemental man named Rumpelstiltskin came into the room without revealing his name and said, "I can help you. I can spin this straw into gold, but what will you give me in return? And so the princess had some jewelry. She handed over. The little man accepted and got about spinning the straw into gold. The next day, when the king arrived, he was astonished to see a room full of gold instead of straw. But now the king got a little bit greedy and said, all right, well, I'm not going to free you yet, not going to marry you yet. I'm going to put you in another room with more straw that you will spin into gold. And so again, the girl was distraught, but once again the little man showed up and said, I will do this for you again, but what will you give me? And again, the girl only had at this point left her ring, which she gave to the little man, who then set about spinning the straw into gold. And again the next day, the king was astonished to find even more gold than before. And being a little bit greedy still, said, all right, well, you have to do this one more time to prove your worth. And so I will now fill the room with straw, which you will spin into gold. And so again, the girl was very distraught. And the man showed up, but the girl said, I have nothing left to give you. And so the little man thought about it and said, you do, for when you marry the king, you will bear a child, and it is the child that you will give to me. Being desperate, the girl agreed. And so the little man spun all of the straw in the room into gold, and the next day the king showed up and was absolutely amazed at a room full of gold, and on the spot freed the girl and promised that he would marry, and so they did. And as time went by, the girl had a child that she loved dearly. And one day, once again, the little man showed up and said, it is time to honor our agreement. You must give me your firstborn child. Now, the girl had grown very, very fond of this child and did not want to do that. The little man insisted, you must. It is our agreement. And so he said, I will go away and come back, but at that time, you must say goodbye to your child, for I will take it. Now the girl thought about what to do, and thought and thought and thought. And the little man had said before he left, there is only one way that you can break this agreement, and that would be if you can guess my name. And so the girl thought and thought and thought of all the names she could think of, and had many different servants go throughout the land and collect all the names she could think of. And she looked at the list and thought, none of these seem to be the kind of name that this little man would have, this elemental being, this elemental spirit. I am at a loss. Until she thought, I will have one servant go and find him and spy on him, and perhaps he will learn something. And so she sent her servant out into the woods. Eventually, the servant was able to track down the little man, who was dancing in a glade and singing a song in which he revealed his name to be Rumpelstiltskin. And so he went back to the queen and said, this is his name. And so when the little man showed up again, he said, have you guessed my name? And she said, is it this and is it that? Toying with him, for she knew his name. And he said, no, no, you owe me the child. And finally she said, is it Rumpelstiltskin? And in a fit of rage, the little man disappeared, for she had guessed his name and broken the vow, and was able to keep the child and live happily ever after. Now, in these two stories, there are many different kinds of things that here and there may be positive and negative on their own. But if we examine the concept, first of all, of Sleeping Beauty, while it may seem to be a positive ending, a positive outcome, the prince comes along and kisses her, she awakes, and they live happily ever after, there are many different symbols in here that actually turn this story into something quite different. First and foremost, the idea being that in the original feast, when the child was born, not inviting that particular fairy is symbolic and representative of the invalidation of a negative belief. And because the negative belief was invalidated, then in a sense it amplified and bounced back with the idea of the curse. Now the curse was mitigated by the final fairy into nothing more than a slumber. But this is simply indicative of the fact that you always have an indestructible core, and no matter how many fear-based or negative beliefs that you may invalidate within you or give energy to, you will always have the ability to mitigate them, to soften them out by remembering that they are just beliefs, and they have no real ultimate power until such time as you decide that they do. And so when Sleeping Beauty found the spinning wheel, regardless of the fact that they had tried to destroy all the spinning wheels in the kingdom, she found one hidden away, pricked her finger, and fell into a long slumber. And in fact, in the story, everyone in the kingdom fell asleep for 100 years, until such time as 100 years later, with no one aging while they slept, a prince came along, kissed her, woke her up, and she lived happily ever after. However, the symbology here is the symbology of victimhood, succumbing to the idea that you have no power to be able to really defeat this other than the flow of creation and synchronicity, which, as we have said, slightly bends in the direction of positive energy rather than negative, because the balance point between positive and negative, the neutral balance point, still offers you the ability to choose. And if there is nothing else that you do, because the universe then, creation then, is slightly more positive than negative, you will simply start to drift toward the positive. And this is what has happened in this story, is that as she slumbered, there was no actions taken, nothing that could be done until such time, 100 years later, that the flow of creation and synchronicity finally attracted the prince, who then allowed her to awake. But you see, the real symbology here is that, in a sense, Sleeping Beauty died and had to be awoken into a different plane of existence, into a different reality, the spirit realm, than to live happily ever after. So in a sense, the tale of Sleeping Beauty, while it may have bits and pieces that are positive and negative within it, overall is a tale of victimhood and the succumbing to the idea of needing to be rescued and not taking any actions in order to be able to rescue yourself, but only relying on nothing more than the flow of creation and synchronicity to pull you out of it, but not having lived that life at all, and having to go on to another plane of existence in order to continue to experience the idea of your happiness. Whereas Rumpelstiltskin, while having, again, what seems to be many negative aspects to it, the girl is sold off by her father, the girl is trapped in the castle, the girl is forced to do things she's not able to do, the girl is forced to give up things in order to transform in a way that will free her, by relying on the little man, the elemental being, to spin the straw into gold. Nevertheless, even though she may have in some sense exhibited victimhood throughout the story to a certain degree, at a certain point she took charge. She ordered her servants to go find names. She ordered her servant to find the little man and find out his name. In other words, what this represents is the identification of the fear-based belief. She was able to identify it literally by finding the little man's name. And in finding the name, in identifying the fear-based belief and bringing it into the light of her consciousness, she was able to break free from that and let it go and truly take the actions that were required to keep her child, to be the queen, to be free, and to truly live happily ever after by her own actions. Therefore, the overall tale of Rumpelstiltskin, no matter how many negative elements it may have contained, is a positive outcome based on her ability to be self-reliant, self-activated, and actually identify and release the fear-based belief that had beset her up to that point. So within these kinds of stories, and within the stories you may tell yourselves about who you are, what you believe to be true about yourselves in life, while sometimes you may think certain things represent a positive idea, they may actually represent a negative one in the sense of feeling like you must be rescued and you can't do it yourself. That is disempowerment. Whereas, no matter how negative things may seem up to a certain point, the acceptance of your own power and the willingness to investigate those fear-based beliefs will always bring you the information you need to divest yourself of them and truly create by your own actions the freedom that you deserve in life. To claim your own true birthright. To be who you truly are. So, let yourself discern more clearly when you tell yourself stories about yourself which is truly positive and which is truly negative, so that you can always have the ability to be active in your self-investigation, to know yourself, become transparent to yourself, and free yourself with the truth of who you really are. We thank you now for allowing us to share this particular perspective with you in Fairy Tales for Grown-ups, and we ask in return, how may we continue to be of service to you? You may begin with your questions and discussions if you wish.